The execution site burned beneath twin moons, a scorched plateau where the Galactic Empire had made its decree clear. The children were lined up, trembling, their wide eyes reflecting the cold gleam of the enforcement drones. The officers did not ask for names. They did not care for the terrified gasps or the way the smallest ones clung to each other. This was a matter of doctrine, of order. Humanity was to be reduced. The Empire had no need for their offspring. A signal was given. Pulse rifles charged with a hum. The air tightened, heavy with silence before the first shot cut through the dark. No one noticed the shift in the wind. Not at first. The officers remained fixed in their brutal task, but the sands began to swirl unnaturally, twisting against the force of gravity. A metallic scent bled into the air, sharp as cut steel. The night deepened, swallowing light, and the youngest among the condemned whispered something lost to time, an old word, half forgotten even by humanity. Somewhere beyond the ridge, something answered. A breath. A presence. The world itself recoiled. The captain of the execution squad turned sharply, his neural interface flickering as an unauthorized frequency spiked through his systems. His men tensed. Weapons recalibrated, scanning for anomalies. But it was too late. The darkness moved. Not a shadow, not a trick of the moon, something ancient and deliberate, something with a hunger so old it had been buried in forgotten myth. The first soldier fell without a sound, his body collapsing into a heap of desiccated flesh before his mind even understood he had died. Another stumbled back, pulse rifle flaring in panic, but the darkness caught him mid-fire. His scream was swallowed whole. They tried to run. It did not matter. The force that came for them did not break, did not hesitate. A shape stepped from the void, slow, unhurried, as if savoring the inevitability of what would come next. Her outline shimmered, distorted, shifting between form and something far more terrible. For a moment, her features resolved into something almost human, eyes like furnace embers, skin marked with the remnants of forgotten incantations. And then she was gone again, a blur of motion, as the third executioner was lifted into the air, his body convulsing before his own bones were turned to dust. The captain stumbled backward, mouth dry. He knew the stories. Every soldier of the Empire did. The Yaga Baba. The myth. The nightmare. A name whispered among prisoners before their execution, a tale told in hushed voices by officers too tired to sleep. A mother who avenged what was taken. A thing that did not die, that did not forgive. His pulse rifle shook in his grip. He fired. The shot never landed. A single whisper brushed against his ear, though no breath touched his skin. You should have let them live. The world tore apart. The captain did not die instantly. That was the first mercy and the last. His body locked in place, nerves burning as something older than flesh wove into his being, hollowing him from the inside. He saw his own hands trembling, but they were no longer his hands. The armor plating of his gauntlets darkened, veins of some shifting liquid void crawling over the surface, devouring the imperial insignia. His body convulsed as his lungs forgot the rhythm of breath, his mind filling with something else, something vast. He tried to scream, but his lips did not belong to him anymore. The voice that came from his mouth was not his own. The remaining executioners ran, pulse rifles discarded in the sand, survival instincts overriding duty. One made it as far as the outcrop before the air thickened, folding in on itself. The space between steps stretched unnaturally, his sprint slowing to an agonizing crawl, as if reality had decided he was no longer permitted to leave. A sound filled his skull, low and primal, pressing into the fragile tissue of his mind with the weight of something unfathomably ancient. It whispered his name, not the one recorded in the Empire's databases, but the first name he had ever been given, the name his mother had whispered before she was taken by the Dominion's culling squads. The whisper unmade him. What fell to the sand was not a body, not anymore. The last survivor stumbled to his knees, dry heaving, his helmet display flashing red warnings. Proximity breach. No identifiable life signatures. oxygen levels spiking with anomalous particles. None of it mattered. He could feel her behind him, a breath against the back of his skull, though she was too far to be touching him. Slowly, with all the certainty of a doomed man, he turned. She stood motionless, bathed in the eerie glow of the twin moons. Her cloak shifted against the wind, though the fabric was something else entirely, rippling as if it did not obey the same physics as the world around it. The scars on her face were old, cut deep, not by battle but by grief carved into flesh. Her eyes, those burning embers of wrath, did not blink. The Empire had called her a story, a specter of vengeance spun from human desperation, a thing to keep rebels hopeful and officers uneasy. But she was not a story. She was real. She was here. And she had come for them. His voice cracked as he tried to speak, tried to beg, but no words came. He had seen planetary bombardments, watched cityscapes crumble beneath the Empire's iron rule, stood atop mountains of nameless corpses, but he had never felt fear like this. The Empire had promised supremacy, had told him that humanity had no gods, no devils, that they were myths of a dying species. The Yaga Baba was no myth. A sharp gust of wind stirred the dust, revealing the bodies of the children, the ones the Empire had deemed unnecessary. The reason for this slaughter. Their small forms lay still, untouched by time or mercy, their blood drying against the cracked earth. He looked back at her, realizing now why the air had changed, why the night had grown thick with something that should not be. She had not come for vengeance. Vengeance was too small a word. She had come to balance the scales. Her hand rose, fingers curling in a slow, deliberate motion. He felt his throat tighten, the weight of an unseen force pressing down, squeezing the life from him cell by cell. The last thing he saw before darkness took him was the reflection of the dead in her eyes, as if they were watching from the abyss, waiting for justice that had been denied too long. Silence fell. Not the silence of a battlefield, but something deeper. A silence that marked the end of things. She exhaled, her breath curling in the cold air, dissipating like smoke. The bodies of the executioners lay in twisted heaps, their remains barely recognizable. The Empire would come for them, of course. They always did. The weight of their response would be seismic, their retribution merciless. But it would not matter. She turned to the horizon, where the first traces of dawn bled into the sky, staining it in hues of violet and crimson. The wind carried the scent of metal and dust, a reminder that this was not the end. This was only the beginning. Far above, beyond the reach of mortal sight, something stirred. The Empire had been watching, and they were afraid. The sky above the execution site was no longer empty. High in the stratosphere, beyond the burn of sunrise, an Imperial stealth frigate hovered in silence, its hull black against the void. It had been watching, recording every scream, every unnatural death, every moment that defied the Empire's understanding. The crew aboard had witnessed things they were never meant to see, things that should not have been real. Yet here they were, staring at screens flickering with the impossible, listening to comm channels filled with the absence of a report. No one had survived. Inside the frigate's command chamber, an officer stood rigid, his breath measured, fingers clenched behind his back. His uniform bore the insignia of the Imperial Observer Corps Watchers, chroniclers, the unseen eye that gathered intelligence where others bled and died. He had been assigned here under orders that were clear. Monitor the purge. Verify compliance. Submit findings to High Command. But there was nothing to verify now. The purge had turned to ruin. The hunters had been devoured. The bridge crew worked in uneasy silence, their movements precise, controlled. The air carried a scent of recycled oxygen and tension thick enough to cut. No one spoke of what they had seen below. The screens showed residual heat signatures, the dead twisted in ways that suggested no known weapon. The shadows where bodies had stood moved slightly, as if something still lingered. The officer exhaled slowly. He reached toward the holo console, activating an encrypted channel that only the highest ranks could access. His voice, when he spoke, was low, measured. Observation Report. Galactic Order Purge Squad designated Zenthara 7 eliminated. Unconfirmed entity present. Unknown anomalous force detected. Requesting immediate directive. The console flickered. Then, a response. A single message. HOLDPOSITION. FURTHERORDERSINCOMING. DONOTENGAGE. The officer's jaw tightened. They wanted him to wait, to sit above this cursed ground and stare into the abyss that had just swallowed an entire squad without effort. He glanced at the data readouts, atmospheric fluctuations, unexplained electromagnetic interference, thermal distortions where no life remained. And then something changed. A new reading spiked across the sensors. A pulse. A low, rhythmic signature pulsing from beneath the execution site, deep underground. The officer's stomach turned. The Empire had chosen this place for a reason. It was a strategic burial ground, a site where old battles had left ruins buried beneath the sand. The pulse was coming from below, something waking, something answering the presence of the Yaga Baba. He turned sharply. Scanned beneath the surface. Full depth. A technician hesitated, then obeyed, fingers dancing across the console. The results came in seconds later. The technician's breath hitched. "Sir, there's something down there." Structure detected beneath the rock. Not natural. Dimensions are massive. And the pulse, it's increasing. The officer stared at the display, dread pooling in his chest. This wasn't just a random killing ground. This wasn't just a backwater rebellion. The Empire had built over something ancient, something they had ignored for centuries, believing it dead. And now, after all this time, it was waking up. Down below, in the depths beneath the execution site, the ruins began to stir. Dust fell from the ceiling of long-forgotten corridors, steel reinforcements groaning as power surged through dead conduits. The pulse grew stronger, reverberating through the rock, a slow, methodical heartbeat of something vast. Shadows slithered through corridors untouched by time. Machinery, long dormant, flickered with dying light. Something was waiting. And now, it knew it was not alone. The officer's fingers twitched at his side. His mind screamed at him to issue the order, to pull the frigate away from this place, and report what he had seen from a safe distance. But the Empire did not tolerate hesitation. He had his orders. Hold position. Observe. He forced his voice steady. How deep does the structure go? The technician swallowed hard, eyes darting over the unstable readings. Unknown. Scanners aren't penetrating fully. Composition isn't standard rock. There's interference. It's old, sir. Very old. Possibly pre-Empire. The officer turned his gaze back to the observation feed. The ruins below pulsed, slow and patient, as if tasting the air for what had disturbed its slumber. He thought of the Yaga Baba, the whispers in the void, the myths of a force that moved unseen, a thing that had no name in the Empire's records, only the absence where a name should be. The execution was supposed to be the end of it. And yet, below them, something stirred. A sharp beep cut through the silence. One of the comm officers turned pale. Incoming transmission, unregistered signal. Source? Unknown. It's not from the surface. The officer narrowed his eyes. Put it through. The speakers hissed. A voice, fragmented and layered, crawled through the static. Not machine. Not entirely human. It came in slow, deliberate words, spoken as if savoring their weight. You watched. The bridge fell deathly silent. The officer's breath hitched. Every instinct screamed at him to cut the feed, but he forced himself still. Who is this? A soft exhale, almost a chuckle. You already know. The officer gritted his teeth. If you're requesting negotiation, you are nothing to negotiate with. The lights flickered. The ship's artificial gravity wavered for half a second, a sensation like unseen hands pressing against their chests. Every console glowed with erratic data streams, code shifting too fast to process. The crew scrambled to stabilize systems, fear creeping into their movements. The words slammed into the ship's systems like a hammer. Lights flickered, energy conduits surged, and the gravity well buckled under the strain of forces they couldn't quantify. The crew fell against their stations, choking on air that suddenly felt too thin. The officer's vision darkened at the edges. The ship itself groaned, like a living thing being bent to a foreign will. Then, just as suddenly, the pressure lifted. The void outside remained, silent and waiting. The ruins below pulsed brighter, their intricate patterns now fully awake. The officer struggled to his feet, heart pounding. They had not merely stumbled upon a lost structure. They had rung the bell of something ancient, something that still remembered the taste of war. And now, it was looking at them. The silence that followed was heavier than the ship's gravity. No one moved. No one breathed. The whisper had been clear, unmistakable. Mother. A single word, but it had cut through the void like a blade, carving into their minds, into the very fabric of the ship itself. The officer clenched his jaw, steadying himself as he forced his gaze back to the main display. The void was still there, its presence gnawing at the edges of reality, something that refused to be fully seen, fully understood. The ruins below pulsed again, no longer a forgotten relic, but a living thing, a heart beating beneath the surface of the dead world. The sensor technician's voice was barely above a whisper. "Sir, whatever that thing is, it's not just observing us." His fingers danced across the console, trying to isolate the energy signatures now flooding the ship's instruments. He swallowed. "It's reaching into our systems." The officer's fingers tightened into a fist. "Shut it down. Sever all non-essential connections. Force a reset if you have to." The technician hesitated, then obeyed, his hands moving with frantic precision. But it was too late. The ship's primary systems flickered, the mainframe struggling against something that was no longer external. The interference wasn't just data corruption or a signal breach. It was something deeper. A presence threading itself through their code, rewriting the ship in ways that didn't make sense. Then the first scream came. A crewman convulsed at his station, his body jerking like a marionette caught in invisible strings. His veins darkened, turning an unnatural black that spread like ink beneath his skin. His eyes went wide, his pupils dilating into endless pits. The sound that left his throat wasn't human. It was layered, distorted, an echo of something far older than the Empire. And then, impossibly, he spoke in that same voice that had crawled through the comms. "You took them." The officer's heart slammed against his ribs. The crewman wasn't looking at him. His vacant gaze was locked onto the forward display, onto the void that loomed just beyond their reach. "You burned their bones. You silenced their names." A second scream. Another officer collapsed, his breath strangled by something unseen. More convulsions. More voices. The officer snapped into action. "Medical team, contain them. Now." But the medics hesitated. Fear twisted their expressions. Because they knew, just as he did, that this wasn't something that could be treated with injections and stabilizers. This was something else entirely. Then the ship shuddered. The void outside pulsed, its blackness rippling as if something within it was stirring. A presence that had been watching, waiting, now beginning to move. The officer's mind raced. The Empire had encountered anomalies before. Forbidden worlds, ancient derelicts, things that defied their understanding of physics and time. But this was different. This wasn't a lost civilization, a malfunctioning AI, or a rogue experiment. This was a reckoning. "Sir?" One of the engineers shouted from across the bridge, her voice laced with panic. The ship's engines, they're spooling on their own. The officer turned to the control panel. The readouts were impossible. The ship's FTL drive was activating, power levels climbing toward a forced jump sequence. But they weren't locked onto any coordinates. No destination. No trajectory. The ship wasn't leaving. It was being taken. The officer moved, shoving past stunned crew members. "Override the sequence." Manual disengage. We can't. The engineer gasped. It's bypassing our commands. It's rewriting our systems. The display flickered again, new data flooding the screen. The symbols weren't Imperial Standard. They weren't anything known to human language. The officer's gut twisted as he recognized the shapes, the geometric precision, the same patterns that had appeared in the ruins below. This wasn't interference. This wasn't an attack. This was an integration. The ship lurched. Space warped. The forward viewport cracked as reality bent inward, folding around them like the closing of an iron fist. The screams of the afflicted crew members merged into a singular, unholy chorus, their voices no longer their own. And then, the void finally spoke again. You will know what you have done. The ship vanished. The void swallowed them whole. The ship did not travel through hyperspace, nor did it follow the known laws of reality. It was dragged, unwound, stripped of its presence in the universe and deposited somewhere else, somewhere the Empire had never dared to reach. The bridge was silent, save for the static hum of failing systems. The officer staggered, disoriented, his vision swimming as gravity reasserted itself in an unfamiliar way. His crew lay scattered around him, twitching in the aftermath of something that had reached into them, rewritten them at a level deeper than flesh. The forward viewport, cracked but still holding, revealed the impossible. They were no longer near the ruined planet. The stars themselves had changed, the constellations wrong, bent, stretched as if they existed in a place outside time. A dark mass loomed ahead. Not a ship, not a station. It was something ancient, something carved into the bones of the universe itself. Black monoliths hovered in perfect formation, their surfaces etched with the same geometric patterns that had infected the ship. Structures that pulsed as if breathing. The officer barely registered the data flowing across the screens. The ship's core temperature was fluctuating wildly. Their power reserves were dropping, being drained. The hull itself was becoming something else. The metal darkened, shifting like liquid, patterns forming in places that had been smooth minutes ago. A whisper crawled through the comms. No distortion now. No interference. A voice, clear, steady, ancient. You have arrived. The officer turned, his breath shallow. The afflicted crew members were rising, their eyes still black voids, but their bodies no longer convulsing. They stood in unison, silent, waiting, no longer mere soldiers of the Empire. Something else entirely. A pulse rippled through the ship. The monoliths responded. The patterns on their surfaces shifted, revealing symbols that pulsed in perfect synchronization with the infected metal of the hull. Then the officer understood. They had not been taken as prisoners. They had been brought as offerings. The void was not empty. It was waiting to be filled. A slow horror dawned in his mind. The Empire had killed children here, thinking them lesser, insignificant. But they had not been children. They had been seeds. And now the harvest had begun. The whisper came again, from all around, from within. The mother wakes. The monoliths trembled. The darkness between them thickened, shifting, unraveling. Something stirred beyond the veil. The officer reached for his weapon. It was a foolish instinct. He was already dead. The void swallowed them once more.